The story of the B-17 Flying Fortress begins not in the skies above Germany, but on the cold, misty airfields of England in 1943. The men of the United States Air Forces were young, often barely out of high school, yet they carried the weight of history on their shoulders. Each mission was a gamble with fate, and each takeoff could be their last. On this particular morning, the crew of one B-17 prepared for a mission that would etch their names into legend. The Flying Fortress was a marvel of engineering, massive, rugged, and bristling with defensive guns. Its nickname was no accident. The aircraft was designed to absorb punishment and keep flying, a steel guardian in the sky. The crew moved with a mixture of routine and tension. The pilot checked the controls, the co-pilot adjusted oxygen masks, the navigator spread maps across his knees, and the gunners loaded belts of ammunition into their Browning .50 caliber machine guns. Outside, ground crews fueled the bomber, their hands blackened with grease, their faces grim. They knew too well how many of these planes never returned. The airfield was alive with activity. Engines roared, propellers spun, and the smell of oil and smoke filled the air. Dozens of flying fortresses lined up, ready to take off in formation. The mission? A deep strike into Nazi Germany, targeting industrial centers that fed Hitler's war machine. As the bomber lifted off, the crew felt the familiar vibration of the engines. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds, but the formation climbed steadily. Each man knew his role. Each man knew the risks. They had heard stories of bombers shredded by flak, of crews lost to enemy fighters, of planes vanishing into smoke and fire. Yet they pressed on, driven by duty, by camaraderie, and by the hope that somehow they would see another dawn. The Flying Fortress was more than just a machine. It was a symbol. To the men inside, it was their lifeline, their shield, and their weapon. And on this day, it would prove itself in ways no one could have imagined. The roar of the engines was steady, but inside the B-17, every man felt the tension rising. The Flying Fortress was now deep into enemy skies, its massive frame vibrating under the strain of altitude and speed. The crew knew what awaited them: flak, fighters, and the constant threat of death. The navigator leaned over his maps, tracing the route with a trembling finger. "We're crossing into German territory," he announced, his voice tight. The pilot nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. Outside, the sky was deceptively calm, but the crew knew it was only a matter of time before the storm began. Then it came. The first bursts of flak exploded around them, black clouds of smoke blossoming in the sky, each one a deadly flower. The fortress shuddered as fragments of steel whizzed past. The crew ducked instinctively, though the armor of the plane was their only shield. "Hold steady," the pilot barked. His knuckles whitened on the controls. The co-pilot adjusted altitude, trying to weave through the deadly barrage. The bombardier, crouched in the nose, peered through his sight, waiting for the moment to release their payload. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe arrived. Sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s streaked across the sky, their engines screaming. They dove into the formation, cannons blazing. The waist gunners swung their .50 caliber machine guns into position, firing bursts of tracers that lit up the sky. The ball turret gunner twisted in his cramped sphere, his world spinning as he tracked the incoming fighters. The air was alive with chaos. Explosions thundered, bullets tore through metal, and men shouted over the roar. One bomber in the formation erupted in flames, spiraling downward. Another broke apart mid-air, its pieces scattering like confetti. The crew of the fortress watched in horror, knowing they could be next. Inside their own plane, the engineer checked gauges frantically. One engine sputtered, coughing smoke, then caught again. The pilot fought to keep the fortress level, sweat dripping down his face. The radio operator tried to maintain contact, his voice shaking as he relayed their position. The gunners fired relentlessly. "Got one!" shouted the tail gunner as a Messerschmitt burst into flames, spiraling downward. But for every fighter they drove off, more appeared. The Luftwaffe was relentless, determined to tear the bombers apart before they reached their target. The crew's bond was tested in those moments. Each man depended on the others. Each man fought not just for himself, but for the survival of the crew. Fear was ever present, but so was courage. They had trained for this, and now their lives depended on it. The fortress absorbed punishment, its thick armor shielding the crew from the worst of the blasts. Holes appeared in the wings, fragments tore through the fuselage, but the plane kept flying. The men inside clung to hope, praying that the fortress would live up to its name. As the formation pressed on, the sky grew darker with smoke and fire. The mission was far from over, but already the crew had faced the fury of the enemy. And though the odds were against them, the fortress still flew, defiant against the storm.
The attack came like lightning. One moment the crew was firing back at the Luftwaffe, the next moment a deafening explosion ripped through the belly of the flying fortress. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard. A metallic scream, a tearing roar that shook the entire aircraft. The bomber lurched violently, throwing men against the walls. Oxygen masks slipped, ammunition belts scattered, and the cabin filled with smoke and dust. For a heartbeat, the crew thought the fortress had been split in two. When the haze cleared, disbelief froze them in place. A hole the size of a truck gaped in the fuselage, jagged steel edges bent outward, torn like paper. The wind howled through the opening, a furious torrent that whipped maps, jackets, and fragments of metal into the air. The waist gunners stared at the destruction, their eyes wide. "My God," one whispered, his voice drowned by the roar of the wind. The engineer scrambled forward, his face pale, trying to assess the damage. He knew instantly no bomber should have survived a hit like this. The pilot fought the controls, sweat dripping down his forehead. The fortress shuddered, threatening to break apart. "Hold her steady," he shouted, his voice hoarse. The co-pilot gripped the yoke, muscles straining, as if sheer willpower could keep the plane together. Inside the bomber, chaos reigned. The radio operator clutched his headset, trying to send a message through the static. The navigator's maps flew out the hole, lost to the sky. The gunners braced themselves, their positions now exposed to the open air. Yet, against all logic, the fortress kept flying. The engines roared defiantly, the wings held firm, and the bomber refused to fall. The crew realized they were living inside a miracle, a machine that should have died, but instead fought to live. Fear mingled with awe. The men knew that one wrong move could tear the plane apart completely. Every vibration, every gust of wind threatened to finish what the explosion had started. But the fortress endured, its steel frame clinging to life. The Luftwaffe fighters circled, astonished at the sight. They had seen bombers fall apart under lighter damage, yet this one still flew. Some pilots pressed their attack, others hesitated, unnerved by the stubborn resilience of the flying fortress. Inside, the crew's bond deepened. They were no longer just soldiers, they were survivors, bound together by fate and steel. Each man fought not only for himself, but for the brother beside him. The fortress had become more than a machine. It was a living symbol of their will to endure. The bombardier, crouched in the nose, looked back through the fuselage. The hole yawned behind him, a reminder of how close death had come. He whispered a prayer, then returned to his sight, determined to finish the mission. The pilot steadied the plane, his jaw clenched. "We're not going down," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. The words carried through the cabin, a spark of defiance that lit the crew's hearts. The fortress pressed on, battered but unbroken. The hull was a wound, but it was also a badge of honor, a testament to the toughness of the aircraft and the courage of the men inside.
The flying fortress was wounded, but it was not defeated. The gaping hole in the fuselage roared like a beast, the wind tearing through the cabin with relentless fury. Every man inside knew that the bomber should have already fallen from the sky. Yet somehow, impossibly, it still flew. The pilot's hands trembled on the controls. The yoke resisted him, jerking violently with every gust of wind. Sweat dripped down his forehead, soaking into his oxygen mask. "She's fighting me," he muttered, his voice hoarse. The co-pilot leaned in, gripping the controls with him, muscles straining as they forced the fortress to stay level. The engineer scrambled through the fuselage, his boots slipping on scattered debris. He checked wires, patched leaks, and secured loose panels with whatever he could find. His hands were raw, his face pale, but he refused to stop. "We're not going down," he whispered to himself, as if the words alone could hold the fortress together. The gunners, exposed to the open air through the massive hole, clung to their positions. The waist gunner fired bursts at incoming fighters, his teeth clenched against the icy wind. The tail gunner shouted warnings, his voice nearly lost in the chaos. The ball turret gunner twisted in his sphere, firing at shadows that darted across the sky. Every man fought, not only the enemy, but the plane itself. The fortress groaned under the strain, its steel frame bending, its engines roaring defiantly. The crew's bond was tested to its limits. They were no longer just soldiers, they were brothers, bound together by survival. The Luftwaffe pressed their attack, circling like predators. Cannon shells ripped through the sky, tracers streaked past the bomber, and explosions thundered around them. Yet the fortress refused to fall. The gunners fired relentlessly, their tracers carving lines of defiance across the sky. One German fighter burst into flames, spiraling downward. Another broke off, unwilling to face the stubborn resilience of the bomber. Inside, the crew clung to hope. The navigator, his maps gone, relied on instinct and memory. The radio operator fought static, trying to send a message home. The bombardier crouched in the nose, his eyes fixed on the target, determined to complete the mission despite the chaos behind him. The pilot's voice cut through the roar. "We're still in this fight," he said, his tone steady despite the fear in his eyes. The words carried through the cabin, a spark of defiance that lit the crew's hearts. They were battered, bleeding, and exhausted, but they were not broken. The fortress pressed on, its massive wound a badge of honor. The hole was a reminder of how close death had come, but it was also proof of survival. The bomber had become more than a machine. It was a living symbol of courage, resilience, and the will to endure. The bomber turned westward, limping away from the burning skies of Germany. The crew knew the mission was far from over. In fact, the hardest part had just begun, the long, perilous journey back to England. Inside the fortress, exhaustion weighed on every man. The waist gunners slumped against their weapons, their faces pale from oxygen masks and fear. The navigator hunched over his charts, though most of his maps had been torn away by the wind rushing through the gaping hole. He relied now on instinct, memory, and the faint outlines of rivers and towns below. The radio operator fought static, his trembling hands adjusting knobs, trying desperately to send a signal home. "Mayday, fortress damaged, returning alone." His voice cracked, but he kept transmitting, hoping someone would hear. The pilot's eyes were fixed on the horizon. Every vibration of the plane felt like a death sentence. The yoke resisted him, jerking violently with each gust of wind. The co-pilot leaned in, muscles straining, forcing the fortress to stay level. Sweat dripped down their faces, soaking into their oxygen masks. Fuel was running low. One engine sputtered, coughing smoke, then caught again. The engineer checked gauges frantically, his hands raw from patching leaks and securing wires. "We're burning too fast," he muttered, his voice tight. The crew exchanged glances. They knew what that meant. If they didn't reach England soon, the fortress would fall from the sky. Outside, the bomber flew alone. The formation had long since vanished, leaving the fortress isolated in hostile skies. The silence was eerie, broken only by the roar of engines and the occasional crackle of the radio. Every mile felt like a victory, every minute a miracle. The crew's bond deepened in those moments. They were no longer just soldiers, they were survivors, clinging to life together. The waist gunner whispered prayers, the navigator muttered calculations, the radio operator begged for a response. Each man fought his own battle, yet all were united by the same desperate hope: to see England again. The countryside below was scarred by war. Smoke rose from burning towns, rivers glistened under the fading sun, and roads crawled with enemy convoys. The crew watched silently, knowing that if they fell, they would land in enemy hands. Capture was a fate they dreaded almost as much as death. Hours passed like years. The fortress groaned under the strain, its steel frame bending, its engines roaring defiantly. The hole in the fuselage yawned behind them, a constant reminder of how close death had come. Yet the bomber pressed on, battered but unbroken. Finally, the coastline appeared, a faint line on the horizon, shimmering in the dusk. The crew's hearts leapt. England was near. Home was near. Survival was within reach. But the danger was not over. The fortress still had to cross the sea, still had to land, still had to prove that miracles could last. The crew braced themselves, knowing that the final test was yet to come. The coastline of England shimmered in the fading light, a promise of safety after hours of terror. Inside the battered B-17, the crew's hearts pounded. They had survived the flak, the fighters, and the catastrophic wound in their fuselage. But one final challenge remained: landing a plane that by all rights should have already fallen from the sky. The pilot's eyes were fixed on the airfield ahead. His hands trembled on the yoke, muscles aching from hours of strain. The co-pilot leaned in, gripping the controls with him, sweat dripping down his face. The fortress groaned under the effort, its engines coughing smoke, its frame rattling with every gust of wind. "Landing gear," the pilot ordered. The engineer moved quickly, pulling the lever. The gear creaked, hesitated, then began to lower. Metal screamed as the damaged hydraulics strained. For a moment, the crew feared the wheels would collapse entirely, but miraculously, they locked into place. The radio operator sent one last message: "Fortress returning, heavily damaged. Prepare emergency landing." His voice cracked, but the words carried across the static. On the ground, crews scrambled, rushing to clear the runway. Ambulances and fire trucks lined up, their sirens wailing. Inside the bomber, silence fell. Each man braced himself, gripping whatever he could. The waist gunners clung to their weapons. The navigator pressed against the wall. The bombardier crouched low in the nose. They had faced death in the skies, but now survival depended on one final moment. The pilot steadied the fortress, sweat dripping into his eyes. He muttered, "Hold her steady." The co-pilot nodded, his jaw clenched.
The engines roared, the wings trembled, and the bomber descended. The runway rushed toward them. The wheels screeched as they touched down, sparks flying. The fuselage groaned, the hole in the side tearing wider. The fortress shuddered violently, threatening to break apart. But the pilot held firm, guiding the bomber down the strip. For a heartbeat, it seemed the plane would collapse. The left wheel buckled, the fuselage tilted, and the crew cried out. But then, miraculously, the fortress steadied. The bomber rolled forward, slowing, its engines coughing one final roar before falling silent. The plane came to a stop. Silence filled the cabin. The crew sat frozen, their hearts pounding, their breaths shallow. Then, slowly, they realized they had made it. Against all odds, they had survived. The hatch opened and the crew stumbled out. Ground crews rushed forward, their eyes widening at the sight of the massive hole. "How in God's name did you fly this thing?" one shouted, disbelief etched on his face. The pilot removed his oxygen mask, his face pale but resolute. He said, "She's a fortress." The words carried across the airfield, a testament to the miracle they had just witnessed. The crew collapsed onto the ground, exhausted but alive. Medics rushed to check them, but most were uninjured, shaken, bruised, but intact. They had faced death and returned, carried home by a machine that refused to die. News spread quickly. Other crews gathered, staring at the battered bomber. The hole was larger than anything they had ever seen, a wound that should have destroyed the plane. Yet here it was, standing on the runway, proof of the resilience of the flying fortress. For the men who had flown it, the landing was more than survival. It was a miracle, a moment that would live forever in their memories. They had trusted their plane, trusted each other, and together they had defied death. Word of the miraculous landing spread across the airfield like wildfire. Ground crews, officers, and fellow aviators crowded around the battered B-17, staring in disbelief at the gaping wound in its fuselage. The hole was so large that a jeep could have driven straight through it. Yet, here the bomber stood, engines silent, wheels locked, its crew alive. For the men who had flown it, the fortress was more than a machine. It was a guardian angel. They had trusted it with their lives, and it had carried them home against all odds. The pilot, still pale from exhaustion, simply said, "She's a fortress." Those words became a mantra, repeated across the base, a testament to the resilience of the aircraft. News traveled quickly. Other squadrons heard the story, then other bases, until the tale reached commanders and newspapers. The flying fortress had already earned a reputation for toughness, but this incident cemented its legend. Crews spoke of it in hushed tones, as if the bomber had defied the laws of physics. Historians later noted that the B-17 was designed with redundancy in mind. Its multiple engines, reinforced frame, and compartmentalized structure allowed it to survive damage that would destroy lesser planes. But even engineers admitted that no design could explain how a bomber with a hole the size of a truck had stayed airborne. It was, they said, a miracle of steel and spirit. Other stories of B-17s surviving impossible damage added to the myth. One fortress returned with its tail nearly severed. Another limped home with engines destroyed. Crews told tales of bombers riddled with bullets, wings shredded, yet still landing safely. Each story added to the aura of invincibility surrounding the flying fortress. For the men who flew them, these stories were more than legends. They were lifelines.
Knowing that their plane could endure gave them courage to face the skies again. The fortress became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest battles, survival was possible. The crew of the broken bomber became heroes among their peers. They were celebrated not only for their courage, but for their bond. Each man had fought for the others. Each had refused to give up, and together they had defied death. Their story was retold in mess halls, briefing rooms, and even in letters sent home. Families marveled at the resilience of the aircraft, proud that their sons flew in something so indestructible. The newspapers captured the drama with bold headlines. Fortress returns with a hole the size of a truck. Photographs of the damaged bomber circulated, shocking readers and inspiring awe. For civilians, the story was proof that American engineering and courage could overcome anything. For soldiers, it was a reminder that miracles could happen even in war. The legend of the Flying Fortress grew with each retelling. It became more than a plane. It became a myth, a symbol of resilience, a steel angel that carried men through fire and fury. And for the crew who had lived it, the memory was etched forever in their hearts.
The war eventually ended, but the legend of the Flying Fortress lived on. For the crew who had survived that mission, the memory of the hole the size of a truck was etched forever in their minds. They had stared death in the face, and yet they had returned home. Their story became more than just a tale of survival. It became a symbol of resilience, courage, and brotherhood. In the years that followed, veterans gathered to share their memories. At reunions, the crew retold the story, their voices trembling with emotion. They remembered the roar of the engines, the chaos of the attack, the moment the fuselage tore open, and the miracle of the landing. Each retelling carried the same awe, the same disbelief, the same gratitude. Historians documented the event, noting that the B-17 was already famous for its toughness. But this particular mission stood out as extraordinary. Engineers marveled at how the bomber had stayed airborne despite catastrophic damage. Pilots used the story as inspiration, proof that even in the darkest skies, hope could endure. Museums preserved the memory. Photographs of the damaged bomber were displayed, shocking visitors with the sheer scale of the destruction. Veterans stood before the images, tears in their eyes, remembering the friends they had lost and the miracles they had witnessed. The Flying Fortress became more than a machine. It became a monument to resilience. For civilians, the story was a reminder of the sacrifices made during the war. Families who had feared for their sons found hope in the tale of survival. Children grew up hearing about the indestructible bomber, inspired by the courage of the men who flew it. The legend became part of the collective memory of a generation. Decades later, the story still resonates. Modern audiences marvel at the toughness of the B-17, at the courage of its crew, and at the miracle of survival. The bomber has become a symbol not only of war, but of endurance, a reminder that even when torn apart, hope can endure. The crew themselves carried the memory for the rest of their lives. Some became teachers, some engineers, some fathers and grandfathers, but all remembered the day when their fortress refused to die. They spoke of it with pride, with humility, and with gratitude. For them, survival was not just luck. It was proof of brotherhood, courage, and the indomitable spirit of the Flying Fortress. Today, the story continues to inspire. Documentaries retell it, books record it, and museums honor it. The image of the bomber with a hole the size of a truck remains one of the most powerful symbols of World War II. It is a reminder that even in the darkest battles, miracles can happen. The Flying Fortress was more than steel and engines. It was a lifeline, a guardian, a symbol of resilience. And for the crew who lived through that mission, it was proof that courage and brotherhood could defy even death itself.